Hello, people hear me? It's been a while since I've done. Can you hear me, chat? Can people hear me? Hello. Stop streaming in a while and you forget how OBS. Life. No filtering. Point. No. Okay. I fixed. Fuck. No, that's not it. I'm trying to fix the thing that I'm trying to pirate. Full screen. No. That. Can people hear me? We can hear you. Okay, not clear now. Reread you. I hope people can hear me. This is going to be like probably the shittest stream I've ever done because I work a lazy wagey job that takes all my time now. How do I fix resize source out? Why is not allowing me to rechange the size? Why can't I? Why is OBS the most stable? I'm trying to steal some weird Indian news channel. It's the only thing I can find that's actually talking about what's happening in Niger. I need to be careful about how I pronounce that country name or else I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. But for some reason, what does that mean? That means nothing. Scale filtering. But for some reason, I can't fucking move the... Right, got something now. But now it's like a big rectangle. Right, we'll see how that goes. It's going to be not. Well, I might do a bit of a map stream, but I'm streaming this Wyon, whatever the fuck this is. Some weird Indian news channel, because it's the only news channel I can find that is like not completely. And I mean this with the best intentions to any Nigerians who might be watching this, but your TV is shit. Your news channels are shit. Like, I had to skim through them and they look diabolically bad. Like, I can't even hear this. This is so loud, it's not even registering on the OBS. It's so quiet, it's not even registering on the OBS to pick up the sound from it. To be fair, I don't know why I'm criticizing this. This channel is better production quality than whatever shit I push out. So I'm trying to look for like African news channels that might be talking about it, but they're not. They're talking about like, one of them was talking about like witches that they discovered in some northern province who were being tried. Another one was like a dancing festival. And then another one was talking about like how gay people are infiltrating African, like Nigerian society. And I'm just like, yeah, I can't be bothered looking at this stuff. So, the only one I can find that's half tolerable is the Indians. So we're not really going to listen to that. That's just for background feed. And this is, we only see in half your screen breaking up. It's like TV in the 80s. I haven't even started the bloody stream yet. But so for people who are not aware, we're going to have another invasion. Another war is breaking out in that place that's so very peaceful and kind. And the white man's come along and made it full of discord again. Africa, we're talking about specifically the African Sahel. And actually, I tell you what, we might as well go for the map stream part of the segment now. This isn't going to be a long stream because I'm tired. And I'm checking Twitter to see reports of big boom booms. Federal Aviation Administration has... Okay, the Americans have issued a NOTAM order for Niger. Let me throw that in. So, I'm a bit scatterbrained, but I'm trying to collect my thoughts. So, very quick rundown, and I'll try and go into a bit more detail about what's happening and why is that a African country. And let's bring up maps. Just go to Google Maps. And then we'll talk about the wheres, the whys, and the whens, and who's and wheres. So, Google Earth doesn't fucking dox me. So, we are talking about the Sahel region of Africa. The Sahel is this part of sub-Saharan Africa that is kind of the bridge between the Sahara and the sub-Saharan Africa. It is where Islamic Africa comes into collision with Christian Africa. It is where, as it's pretty actually decently portrayed here, where the desert starts to transform into your savanna and into your forest. And specifically, we are looking at the western portion of the Sahel. Particularly, this area used to be a area of French colonies. This was French Africa, Africa Français. This was part of the French Empire, at least most of it were. Nigeria, of course, Ghana, and a couple of other countries in this area used to be British, a couple of Portuguese, and way back when, a couple of German colonies. But particularly, we are focusing mostly on the former French colonies in the Sahel, and with the exception of the former British colony in Nigeria, which is playing a massive role in what is happening tonight and over the events that are happening in this area. So, what has happened in Niger? Be very careful how you pronounce that, because even if you spell it correctly and you talk about it, you are still liable to get banned on social media. But we are talking about this country that looks like a chicken wing. Don't read too much into that, called Niger. And what has happened there over the past couple of weeks. So around about 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, there was a military coup. And I am not an expert in African politics, so I'm not going to attempt to delve really into them, apart from the geopolitics of the area. But the quote-unquote democratically elected president of Niger was ousted from power, and a new military government came into effect. And this has upturned the entire political and geostrategic balance in the region, particularly with an organization called ECOWAS, which I will bring up a map of now, which stands for the Economic Community of Western African States. And if there is a very helpful... How big is this picture? Not too big, but I will bring this up because it fits for what we need it for. So this is a map of ECOWAS, or suspended members of ECOWAS. ECOWAS is kind of like the best way to look at it is sort of a developing European Union style organization, an economic and political and security organization of Western African states. But as you can see in this map, is some of these countries are nicely colored green and some of them are red. And of particular note is the red ones, and why are they suspended? The ones that are suspended, that have been kicked out of ECOWAS, are due to the result of a number of military coups d'etats that have happened in the region over the past couple of years. And before we go into the deep politics, we'll mainly touch on the Niger area. So Burkina Faso, Guinea, don't know too much about Guinea. I'm not too sure if that was a military coup or not, but Burkina Faso and Mali are kind of the two big ones at the moment. So As you can see, with Niger dropping out of ECOWAS, it significantly diminishes the territorial size and the potential geostrategic position of ECOWAS. ECOWAS as well is, I'm not going to say it is a vessel for Western influence, but it is certainly aligned more with Western states than it would be with, for example, China, Russia, or competing Western interests in Western Africa. So with the loss of Niger, as you can see, the ECOWAS is effectively being pushed out of the entire Sahel region. And it should also be said that these three particular states are massive resource economies of particular note. Niger and I believe Mali were major producers and exporters of uranium, which they sent back to France. And France is going to feature heavily in this quick video production. So with the dropping out of Niger from ECOWAS, is serious questions are being asked about the sustainability and the future of the entire bloc. It's one thing to lose Mali, it's another to lose Burkina Faso and Guinea, but Niger is kind of, it's at that stage, it's looking like a domino effect, and country after country is suffering a coup d'etat that is pushing countries out of the the bloc. So this was kind of the last straw, and ECOWAS, with backing and encouragement of particularly the French and some speculation at the United States as well, is being talking up the idea of launching a military intervention to restore the quote-unquote constitutional order in Niger and the deposed president back to power. And this is kind of where things get a bit incompetent, African, shall we say. Generally, whenever you hold a revolution, or especially if you're launching a coup d'etat, the best thing that usually, well, one of the key things about a coup d'etat is that you need to take control of the airways. And the previous administration, particularly like the president, the heads of state, the head of government, the heads of ministries, ideally you want to arrest those people and take them out of circulation. That could mean either you kill them, either you arrest them, whatever it means. Going to go back on a quick history lesson here. Whenever the Soviet coup happened in 1991, one of the main reasons it collapsed is because while they arrested Mikhail Gorbachev, Gorbachev still had a telephone, and he was phoning people in Moscow and elsewhere to undermine the KGB coup. They failed to arrest Boris Yeltsin, and Boris Yeltsin mobilized the masses and the airwaves to undermine the coup. So this is just a quick example. For some reason, the new authorities in Niger arrested the president and confined him to, I believe, the presidential palace, but they allowed him to continue to have access to the internet. And the former president has been calling governments left, right, and center, from Washington to Paris to Lagos to other neighboring states, asking and pleading and inviting in a military intervention to restore his rule. He actually wrote an article in, I think, the New York Times, saying that, yeah, please invade my country and restore me to power, which kind of makes me question why the new authorities in Niger have just kind of allowed this guy to continue having access to the phone and the internet to undermine their legitimacy and their hold on the country. So that's kind of a big fuck up on the coupist parts in Niger. But that's kind of the situation where we are at the moment. So that provides a very tepid legal basis for military intervention by ECOWAS and potentially Western states to intervene in the country and restore his rule and turf out the new military government that has established itself. So forgive me, I'm going to be popping in and out, just checking social media to see if there's any reports of big boom booms and if the bongos of war are starting to beat. ECOWAS issued an ultimatum to restore the constitutional government, and as of 33 minutes ago, that ultimatum has expired. So I don't think they might go in quite now, but maybe in the morning, whenever daylight rises, that is when we might see the first hints of military intervention. Look. Not seeing any news at the moment, and Telegram and Twitter are where I'm keeping an eye on this. That's because I don't know what social media they use in way down south in Africa. But as people might remember, on the on February 23rd, 2022, I remember it very well because I was up all night, and it was kind of the big thing that told me that the Russians were going to go into Ukraine, was the issuing of what is called a NOTAM, which in effect it's the closing of the airspace. These happen regularly whenever you have military drills, but whenever they come out of the blue, it means something big is up. So whenever Ukraine and Russia issued a NOTAM over northern and eastern Ukraine on February 23rd, 2022, late in the evening, that's whenever I was just like, that I was kind of still on the mindset that the Russians weren't potentially going to go into Ukraine, but whenever the NOTAM was issued, that's whenever I was like, shit, this is happening. Well, it's happening again. A NOTAM has been issued over Nigerian airspace, and civil aviation is now avoiding the country altogether. So that is kind of a big indication that they're not fucking about on this, because whenever you start fucking about with international civil aviation, that is a big wrench you're throwing into potentially the international economy, into the international airlines routes and stuff. You don't do that lightly. There's a version for like the sea. You can close sea lanes and stuff for similar reasons. I think the Russians did that in the Western Black Sea at the start of their invasion of Ukraine. This is something you don't do lightly. If you're doing that, it's a big indication that you're going to be putting aircraft into the air and start dropping things onto another country, or you're going to start shooting down aircraft in that area. So that's kind of where we are at the moment in Niger. So why particularly Niger? Why didn't this happen in Burkina Faso or Mali? Well, a whole bunch of history and geopolitics starts to come into this, because as I've kind of been talking about, our friends up here in the Slavic lands have a lot of interests and actions that have been going on in this part of the world for a while. No war happens in isolation. And while everyone's been focusing on what's been happening in Ukraine and Russia, Russia has been expanding influence in Africa. So whereas Russian influence has been effectively locked out of pretty much the entire Western world and is on the decline in Central Asia and former Soviet states, Russian influence has been expanding rapidly in Africa for a number of reasons, which is where we will come back to the French angle of this and why this is effectively happening. So, French West Africa included all these states. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are the ones we're going to particularly focus on, but of note, you also have Nigeria comes into this, Mauritania, and Chad, and the Sudan as well to a degree, even though that was a British colony. But it has a sort of similar problem to the three we're going to be talking about here. So these countries get independence from France, but they don't exactly become fully independent. And this is where the concept of neo-colonialism comes into. I'm not a big fan of the whole concept to begin with, but I think it's apt whenever you're talking about French colonies. So colonialism in France, in Africa starts to decline. The old European colonial empires start to break apart. Largely the British colonies, the Belgian, the Portuguese to a degree, although they hold on until the 1970s. But generally, most colonial powers, whenever a country becomes independent from their empire in Africa, the colonial powers largely kind of wash their hands of them. So, for example, like the British colonies, I don't know if I should, well, British colony, like whenever Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Botswana and stuff become independent, apart from remaining a member of the Commonwealth and some tangential economic links with Britain and cultural links, is the British government isn't there continuing to puppet things behind the scenes. These countries effectively go off on their own. So, big example, like Ghana gets independence, effectively almost immediately becomes a member, closely aligned with the Soviet Union. The Congo gets independence from Belgium, immediately falls into civil war and is never recovered for like the past 70 years. Whereas France doesn't do that. France gives independence, quote unquote, to its former colonial subjects in Africa, but it maintains a significant amount of economic, military, and political influence in these countries. Big example being the Central African Republic, which we will touch on to a degree, and the Sahel states. And this is all organized, particularly economically, via the French, well, not so much the French franc, but the African francs in the regional currencies that are used in these countries to this day. I should probably look it up, but Giorgia Meloni, who has sort of fallen out of favor because of her cucked government in Italy at the moment, actually has a very good monologue, if I can find it, explaining just how this mechanism works in Africa. So, found the video, so I'll play this video just to give you an idea, because she actually explains it pretty succinctly how the economic influence of Paris has remained present in these countries. But nonetheless, alongside the economic influence is you have significant French military bases and presence that remain in these countries to this, well, largely to this day, although they've been kicked out of a number of countries. Through the Cold War, France has been alleged to have organized various coups d'etats, overthrows of government that threatened to diminish French influence in the region. The French language has been on the decline for a while, and France has diplomatically and economically tried to kind of force the French language continually as like official languages codified in various national constitutions, as like the common language of, because obviously there's thousands of different African languages. France has tried to position its language, the French language, as like the common national language of convenience, kind of what like English is in India. This is an aspect of French soft power in the region. But tell you what, I'll just play this video of Giorgia Meloni just explaining how the French economic influence in Africa operates. So, not going too much into Giorgia Meloni, that's not the subject of this stream, but she kind of gives it's very simplified, but it's kind of a very basic understanding of how France maintained economic influence across Africa for since independence. You've got the Western African franc, you've got the Central African franc. These used to be pegged to the French franc, so they were effectively controlled by Paris, but of course France now uses the euro, but they still maintain effectively control over the quote-unquote like central bank, for lack of a better term, that controls the currencies of these countries. And for various economic treaties and stuff, is France tends to depress the industrial and the developmental capacity of these African states, and militarily through hard power, through the actual imposition of French military power, they maintain a overt political influence as well in these countries since independence. So if you're wondering of what the French Foreign Legion largely does, the French Foreign Legion is they train in France, in metropolitan France, but they are almost constantly on deployment, particularly in Trad, in the Djibouti, and previously in places like Mali, Niger, and Mauritania, and these countries here on various operations. And I'll go into what these operations have largely been and why this has resulted in a large pushback against French and alongside French Western influence in these states. So the Cold War ends and the constant civil wars and coup d'etats start to take a bit of a back road. Of course, not immediately. In the 1990s is whenever it was the decade of African civil wars. All of Western Africa falls into chaos. But into the 2000s, Africa looks like it's starting to climb out of the stereotype that we have for Africans and Africa. Various countries start to stabilize. Tepid democratic systems start to emerge. Fairly free-ish elections start to be held, and the old period of complete anarchy in parts of Africa at least seems to be on the back burner. So through the 2000s and into the 2010s, you have the rise of particularly Nigeria, which is a booming economy, probably going to be one of the largest economies and largest populations by the end of the century. Ghana, and I think Sierra Leone to a degree, but these countries in West Africa start to build up a bit of an economic growth and climb themselves out of effectively being the stereotypical African country that we have. But into the 2010s, what happens in the Sahel? Well, you have the rise of Islamism. You have, alongside the war in terror in the Middle East, a massive theater of the war in terror is in Africa. We all know that Somalia is a shithole, and it will always be a shithole, and that there's an Islamist insurgency going on there, and it sometimes spill over into Kenya. But a massive front of this sort of international war against Islamism happens in Western Africa. So the 1990s, you have the collapse of the USSR. That means a lot of support for nominally Soviet-aligned African states is effectively cut off. You have the collapse of old socialist-style governments and insurgencies in Western Africa. But in Nigeria, whenever that sort of happens, you have this transition from the old leftist, secular, not exactly communist, but certainly sort of socialist-aligned regime. You have the rise of not democratic, but Islamic forces to oppose it. So in Algeria, you have the 1990s and the 2000s Algerian War, which was kind of a harbinger of what was to come through the rest of the region. In 2011, you have the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, who, although himself was very much Islamic, he kind of kept a lid on the more aggressive elements of Salafism, Salafism being like the major strain of Sunni terrorism, expansionist Sunni terrorism. So whenever Muammar Gaddafi is removed in Libya, Libya falls into anarchy. It becomes a staging point for Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates to propagate not only in Libya, but further south across the borders into Chad, into Niger, and into Mali in particular. So alongside this global upsurge of Islamist terror, particularly in 2014 and 2015, whenever you have the explosion of ISIS across Iraq and Syria, that leads to across the Islamic world, a massive upswing in this sort of very aggressive Islamist Sunni terrorism and insurgent groups. You have outsurges in the Philippines, Malaysia, across the Middle East, and particularly in Africa. The main one that people would be aware of in Africa, of course, is Boko Haram in Nigeria, which has waged decades-long, pretty vicious insurgency across the northern Islamic provinces of the country. But the big first domino to fall in this was Mali. Oh God, when did I need to quickly check? I think it was around about 2012, 2013. When it really kicked off in Mali, because there was a multinational 2012, January 2012. So in 2012, the entire northern part of Mali, so as you can see, Mali has a very interesting shape. The entire northern rung of the country effectively collapses into anarchy. You have an ethnic dimension of this because in this desert area, you have a group called the Tuareg people. They are like the Berbers, if you know of the Berbers up in Morocco and Algeria. These sort of nomadic desert dwellers. They're Muslim, but they're not Salafist Muslim. So yeah, they'll praise Allah and they might fight in a religious war, but what they're mostly about is an ethnic autonomy, their own ethnic state in the Sahel. So you have the Tuareg rebellion, which breaks off most of northern Mali because the Tuaregs don't want to be governed by these quote-unquote secular black Africans to the south. In the chaos, you also have the imposition of groups like ISIS in Africa. Al-Qaeda, Islamist groups start to crop up and take territory across the country, and for a period, it looks like all of Mali might just completely collapse and turn into a complete anarchy or into a ISIS-style Islamic state in Africa. So this leads to an international coalition led by France, which puts troops into the country, onto the ground to stabilize the situation and to assist the Malian army to put down these insurgent groups in the 2010s. So that happens in 2012. 10 years later, the French were still there. And I'm going to touch on this in a bit, but that's kind of what happens there. This happens in Niger. This happens in the Central African Republic. This happens in a number of African states across the region. Is you have these Islamist insurgencies that present a significant threat to the standing quote-unquote legitimate government in various African states. Then you have particularly French military intervention that comes in to quote-unquote stabilize these countries and to try and shore them up and to combat the various insurgent groups. Alongside this, and I think this is where some people might not like what I'm going to say next, but you have climate change. Not getting into the debate of whether it's real or, you know, what causes it and stuff like that. It is happening and it happens in Africa. And don't just hear me out on this because it is pertinent here. Because the Sahara Desert has been growing at a rapid pace to the south. As you can see here, I know this is kind of like a Google map, but let's have a look on satellite. You can see that you have strips of the Sahara boring into these an arid terrain, boring into the former forests and savanna of the sort of sub-Sahel region. Particularly of note, this comes into Burkina Faso. It's particularly bad in Burkina Faso. So it's not just climate change, although the temperature has been reported to be increasing and rainfall has been decreasing in this region for decades. Human activity as well comes a significant part of this. And why am I talking about the environment? It also is a massive pressure onto what has happened in these countries. To put it bluntly, Africans in particular are not the best at environmental stewardship. You have a lot of logging, legal or illegal logging. You have very inefficient and very damaging farming practices. You have very poor irrigation projects. You have stuff. These countries, sometimes with French money and French direction, sometimes by their own or just sort of spontaneous human activity. They do stuff that really damages the environment. And it's particularly keen in this area. You know, if you build an irrigation ditch, so let's just say somewhere in France, you're probably not going to turn the area into a desert because you have regular rainfall that comes into it. In Burkina Faso or Mali, if you build a very poor irrigation ditch, well, all the water that you've put into that irrigation ditch that might just leak out of it and be wasted, well, that might be the town's only water source. And surrounding your town is the Sahara Desert. So all the trees and all the crops in a large area around that used to thrive off that water source is now dead and it's drying out. And this former farmland is now turning into desert. So that is what's been happening a lot across the Sahel region of Africa. And this is greatly creating the rapid expansion of the Sahara Desert further south. And this, of course, puts a lot of pressure onto agriculture, the ability to feed the populations in this area, but also just in general, the economic viability of these states If you're losing farmland, not only are you losing farms that are feeding people, you're losing farms that might be able to export goods abroad and earn in some money for the farmer, but also for the state budget. So alongside this, this is also compounded by European Union tariffs as well, because the European Union operates a thing called the Common Agricultural Policy, which in effect subsidizes European farmers and puts up significant tariffs against non-European farmers. This is why foodstuffs in Europe tend to be fairly more expensive than they would otherwise be outside of the EU. This is particularly why various countries like Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland are holding, putting embargoes on Ukrainian grain because of through things like the CAP, as they look to prop up their own domestic farming industries. But in the effect that this has is that West African agriculture cannot really properly develop because it cannot find a significant market into which to export its goods for foreign capital from which to invest back into their own economies. So that's another aspect that is depressing the economics of Western Africa, and also feeds into if you don't have the capital to invest into more sustainable agricultural practices, you continue the old agricultural practices that are really fucking up the local environment. So you have these number of pressures that are building on the Sahel states over the past decade. So while you have the French, you have these ongoing economic and environmental issues, you also have these French military units based in these countries. And the years roll by, and then people in Mali, people in Burkina Faso, and people in Niger are starting to scratch their heads and wondering, well, we've had French troops in our country for 10 years now, and not only is things not getting better, particularly in Mali, not only is the war against the Islamist insurgencies not getting better, it's actually getting worse. Slowly but steadily, more and more of the government soldiers are being killed. The Islamists and the Tuareg rebels seem to be taking more territory by the month. And whenever we do see French troops, they seem to be swanning about the capital and seem to be paying a close attention to sort of places, French military bases tend to be based in like the capitals and with smaller outposts across the country. And they tend to direct the indigenous military forces that are fighting these various insurgent groups. So particularly in Mali, you have reports of where like Malian soldiers are forbidden to engage Islamist troops unless they are personally attacked, unless they have French say so to engage. In Niger, a big complaint that I've seen going about on social media from the Nigerian military was that from the coups, from the people who enacted the coup in Niger, is that any time that the military wanted to engage the various Islamist groups that are raging across the northern aspects of the country, is that they had to report to their local commander, who then had to report to the French officer on mission, who then apparently had to report back to Paris to ask if they could have permission to engage the Islamist rebels. And this builds up a lot of frustration and naturally aggrieves a lot of the locals in the country, or particularly the military, the officers of these indigenous African states. So there starts to get this idea that, well, why is the French military in this country if all they seem to do is to block and frustrate our war against the Tuaregs or against the Islamist insurgencies raging in our country? Which kind of then feed this into another conflict where this was also a similar issue, was in Afghanistan. Towards the later end of the NATO intervention in Afghanistan, a common complaint on the Afghan population, and Hamid Karzai government in Afghanistan was particularly propagated this idea, is that when are you leaving? Is we keep saying that you want to end the war in Afghanistan, but your troops are here and the war seems to be getting worse and things aren't getting better. And it seems to be that you're more interested in keeping your bases and your political influence, particularly in terms of the United States in Afghanistan, than it seems to be actually fighting this war and winning it and building a prosperous and peaceful Afghanistan. that's the kind of idea that starts to spread in these African countries, is that the French military is more there to keep political influence in these countries and to keep them aligned with Paris than they are to fight the war and defeat the insurgencies. Because if the insurgencies are defeated, if the Islamists and the Tuaregs are pushed out and the entire country is restored to the nominal governments of these countries, well, then there's not really much of a reason for the French government and French military forces to remain in these African states. And there's there's nothing more that propagates influence in a country than having a battalion of French Foreign Legionnaires based in the capital of it. That's kind of a big sign to a indigenous government in Niger, in Burkina Faso, or Mali. It sends a big message that says, you know, if you really piss off Paris, your government might be in trouble. We might not do it ourselves, but we could certainly back up a coup and stand back and allow a coup to oust you from government if that happens. Of course, the theory runs that, well, then also if there's a coup against us, maybe we could send in the French Foreign Legion or our military aspects to put down the coup. But the aspect with that is it's kind of a different age now. This isn't the 60s or 70s. To see Western European soldiers putting down a indigenous coup in an African state, not the best optics in this day and age. So France has kind of backed away from that whenever it's happened in these countries. But this is kind of the overarching dynamic that's happened in these countries. And then I'm going to come to Burkina Faso as well, because I think this is a particularly fascinating note. As that little clip from Georgia Maloney pointed out earlier, that Burkina Faso is one of the poorest countries in the region. Burkina Faso is kind of a very interesting case study in this, because in the 1980s, Burkina Faso had effectively a Marxist revolution, coup d'etat, by a person named Thomas Sankara. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that name. He was kind of this Che Guevara-esque, very forward-thinking, progressive in the not fringe gay way of the term, military leader who took over the country and set about he aligned Burkina Faso very significantly with the Soviet and the socialist bloc, but he also set about significant developmental and social developmental goals across Burkina Faso. Dubious on what the stats are, if they were legitimate or not, or if it's part of the myth that grows up around this man, but nonetheless, he's reported to have significantly reduced illiteracy in the country, brought in various environmental things that started to like replanting forests, more sustainable agricultural methods that started to push back against the growth of the Sahara, expansions and road building, stuff like this. Don't need to go too deep into it, but needless to say is this Thomas Sankara guy kind of inspired a lot of Africa at the time, but he was then ousted by a French coup in the late 80s that resulted in his death, and brought in a very corrupt president, his second in command, who reversed all his previous reforms, and Burkina Faso has just kind of declined since then in living standards and stuff. But up until recently, the new guy who took power, the new military junta that took power in Burkina Faso, is led by a guy who effectively is, he's living up to the idea of Thomas Sankara. Let's see if I can find it. Toure? How do you pronounce that name? Ibrahim, Captain Ibrahim Toure, I think it is. Yes, so this is the current ruling president of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Toure. And as you can see, he strikes a very particular aesthetic he's going for, which is being copied by, I think this is the Malian president here. Yeah, this is the president of Mali. These various new, like, African coup d'etat regimes are very much aping off of this guy's aesthetic, which he himself, if I bring up Thomas Sankara, that's Thomas Sankara. As you can see, they are very much harking back to the aesthetics and the sort of ideology, well, maybe not the ideology, but certainly the aesthetic that Thomas Sankara projected. And he's it's hard for me to say because I don't live in these regions, I don't speak the language and stuff, but the copying of the aesthetics and the sort of rejection of French neo-colonial rule in these regions, I think is largely to be seen as sort of like taking the inspiration, the spiritual and political inspiration from this guy. So he was the president of Burkina Faso for a time in the 1980s. So this is kind of where we come into the rejection of this French rule. So you have these grievances that have built up against France. The wars aren't going well. They seem to be getting worse. You have this ever-present European and particularly French economic dominance that is suppressing the developmental potential of these states. Things start to give. And the big place where they really give to begin with is the Central African Republic. So there is a civil war that, in effect, the Central African Republic, I think, has never not been in civil war since independence. But there was a particularly bad civil war going on in the country, and the French military were in the country trying to, well, quote unquote, trying to stabilize the regime. And the government in the CAR at some point decides actually the French don't really seem to be doing much, if anything, to help us reestablish control over the country. So maybe we should start to look elsewhere. So they find a very, very willing faction in Russia called Wagner. This is where Wagner PMC really starts to make its name. So Wagner starts to deploy to the CAR with various contracts with the government and starts to fight very aggressively with the various rebel groups that control parts of the country. So I know this is Wikipedia, but we just need it for the maps. We are not going to be sourcing it too much. I just need maps to sort of illustrate. Yeah, I'll tell you what, this is a good one here to compare and contrast with this. So you have French forces operating in the CAR for effectively decades, and in 2021 this was the state of the country, red being what is actually controlled by the government, and then a couple of various aligned rebel groups. As you can see, the country is a complete hodgepodge of varying different competing factions that are controlled massive swathes across the country, and central government control probably isn't really felt outside of the capital. So that is the situation in January 2021. Then you have the deployment of the Wagner group later in that year, and this is what Wagner has done to the country. You can see significant portions of the country have returned to Wagner control, well, not Wagner, into central government control. The rebel groups are on the retreat across the entire country, and Wagner is fighting and arguably very substantially winning this war for the central government of the Central African Republic. This does not go unnoticed. This is kind of the big start of Wagner's very overt and very aggressive push across Africa. Is the CAR is kind of the big hallmark that they do for this. Obviously, the CAR is a very poor country, so how do they afford a Russian private army to come in and fight its war for it? This is where Yevgeny Prigozhin has made arguably most of his money. And this is kind of how Wagner, his and Russian influence in Africa has really been putting a toehold in. So whereas the French economic model was more about resource extraction and suppressing the local economy, so controlling the currency and then also trying to flood the market with like European agricultural goods or European industrial goods, and then extracting out resources. Wagner is kind of same but different is Wagner comes in and says, yeah, we'll fight and retake this country for you, but we also want like 60% of a gold mine. We want 80% of a local oil well that you run. We want lucrative contracts to export your goods onto international markets. So it's a very much a quid pro quo arrangement between Wagner and these indigenous African governments. So whereas the French would be like, okay, we'll do this, but you have to vote this way in the United Nations with us, or you have to sign these various treaties and agreements with us. Wagner, it's a very hard level. Give us resources and we'll fight this battle for you, but your internal politics are your own and we'll leave you to it. That seems to be the method of Wagner's operations in particularly the CAR. Alongside this, Wagner is also training up a lot of these African governments, militaries. The French were meant to be doing this, but they never really seemed to have much success. Not going to say too much because we are on YouTube. Does this come down to just the general ability of African soldiers to be able to absorb modern military tactics? Or was this because the French were intentionally trying to undertrain African militaries? The story's out. I guess we'll wait and see how Wagner trains these people, if they get any more competency or such out of them. So you have Wagner arming, bringing in new Russian weaponries and re-equipping and building up the local militaries of these states, while also embedding a significant economic stake in the countries. But Wagner does not operate alone in a vacuum because, of course, I'm not going to touch too much into it because it could be its own stream and I'm not too well versed into it. But Wagner and this Russian influence in places like the CAR and across various parts of Africa, it should be looked at the hard power, and the soft power should be viewed as like Chinese investment. So the Chinese aren't going to put their militaries or even like a private military into an African state to secure its interests. Instead, they will contract that out to Russia and Wagner, whereas the Chinese will bring in the capital to invest in various infrastructural or industrial concerns in African countries. So the way to look at it in this sort of tandem doesn't happen everywhere. It's only in a number of countries, but where it operates is you should look at Wagner and at Russian operations in Africa is sort of like the hard fist, the hard power, and then the Chinese economic power is more of the soft power. So you have this kind of tandem operation going on in Africa. And what is this for? Well, one, to secure economic benefits for Beijing and Russia, but also, more crucially, to push out Western influence in these former colonial states. So with that bit on the CAR, so Central African Republic is kind of the big base for Wagner and kind of the big case example that they use. So that is where Mali starts looking around. They see that the French aren't really seeming to be fighting and winning this war. The war is getting worse. So Mali, the military government, well, there is then a coup in Mali that overthrows the quote-unquote constitutional government. This pisses off the French. The French start to put sanctions onto the new Malian authorities. So Mali starts to look for new friends elsewhere. And they see what Wagner has been able to achieve in the Central African Republic. So then Mali decides to evict French, tells the French military, you're not really doing much. So your right to be in this country is rescinded. And they then invite in Wagner into the country to fight the various insurgencies. So you now have Wagner operating in the Central African Republic, and then they're also fighting a war in Mali. And the war in Mali is very brutal. It's completely up in the air what sources you believe or how many people have been killed or stuff, but the war in Mali has always been brutal. They have massacres on either side. The Tuaregs would massacre people, the Islamists would massacre people, the secular government would massacre people, and there's been allegations that Wagner have assisted the Malian government in massacring like various towns, Islamist towns that have been held. So it's a very brutal war, but let's see if we have a quick check to see if we might have any maps of territorial control from before Wagner's deployment to Mali and after. Timeline map of Mali war. The Wikipedia is usually good at like giving these very basic maps of territorial control at different points in time, but they don't seem to do it for Mali. No, can't seem to. It doesn't seem to do it. Look. No, looks like no one's really done that. So I can't really assess what the actual impact of Wagner has been just on the face of it. Like I say, I don't really pay too close attention to conflicts in Africa, so I can't really give you... No, there isn't. So but needless to say is that the imposition of Wagner is that the war reaches a new tempo, and I'd be very surprised if there hasn't been a return of territory back to government control through the deployment of Wagner into Mali, because they, one, depending on where you side, if the French were actually ever fighting the war effectively, or if they were intentionally undermining it, or if it was just things like rules of engagement problems or whatever. I think Wagner has a far more weighty and a fair bit of punch to its military activities than France would have. So I'd be surprised if we don't have territorial control, an increase in territorial control for the central government in Mali whenever Wagner deployed. Do you have an approximate date that these things are occurring? So yeah, by 2020 and particularly 2021 is whenever you have the big imposition of Wagner into Africa. And these coups start to happen in around about the same timeline, 2020 and 2021. So I believe it was in 2022, you have a coup in Burkina Faso, which brings Touré to government there. I don't think there is really much of a deployment in Burkina Faso of Wagner. Let me have a quick look. Jihadist insurgency. No, I don't think there is actually much of a deployment in Burkina Faso. There's not Burkina Faso. Wagner. No, so they were actually potentially invited in April. So before April, there was not a Wagner operation in Burkina Faso, but nonetheless, 2022. Well, one, you have the war erupts in Ukraine, and this significantly impacts global agricultural production, particularly Ukrainian grain. Largely is removed from the market because of the sanctions on Russia. There is a lot of impositions put upon Russian agricultural exports. They don't leave the market, but it becomes more expensive and a lot more complicated to bring Russian agricultural goods to market. Ukraine is effectively taken out of the market up until the grain deal, which has since been revoked. But needless to say, you have a significant upturning of the international grain market and of agricultural produce. And this has particularly dire effects on Africa because a significant amount of the grain that Egypt and the Sahel states get comes from things like, well, one, Egypt imports it on its own basis, but you have the UN food program, which a lot of the food that the UN food program that feeds people who are on the verge of starvation and poverty comes from particularly Ukraine and to a degree Russia. So that's effectively removed from the market. Well, it's not a market, it's a food program, but that significantly undermines the UN food program. But also, Russia and Ukraine are massive agricultural producers, and even just removing them from the market, at Ukraine from the market, pushes up the cost of grains and cereal products across the globe. So if you think about it, there's less of this good making it onto the market. It becomes more scarce. So therefore, people who are buying it, like the Europeans, will pay more to get it. But countries who don't have the excess capital to buy in this stuff, they start to suffer. So that's what starts to happen across Africa in 2020. Doesn't get dire. It wasn't apocalyptically bad, is what was first projected, but it does further putting pressure onto the local economies in these states that are driven by one, climate change, the environmental degradation of the growth of the Sahara, this ongoing French and to a degree Western and European Union economic suppression, and the ongoing insurgencies and wars that are raging in these countries. So this is another pressure that's put onto it, and then that gives in Burkina Faso, where you have the coup, which overthrows the previous government last year and brings into power Captain Ibrahim Touré. Ibrahim Touré, like I just googled there, doesn't really seem to have been too closely aligned with Moscow or with Wagner. Instead, the thing that seems to have tied him to Mali is this more rejection of France. Is French never really left after independence, and if anything, French influence in these countries seems to be more of a negative, holding them back, than it does to be any kind of benefit. So I think these coups should be read more as a rejection of France than as like an affiliation with Russia. But saying that, affiliation with Russia in Central African Republic and potentially Mali does seem to be a fairly good deal. So this is where you have the footage of French flags being burned, but Russian flags appearing in demonstrations. It's more this rejection of France and finding another international benefactor who might be able to come in and alleviate the situation. So you have these two countries that are part of this juntist faction that it grows up, which undermines ECOWAS, bringing back in the ECOWAS movement. These two countries, very small economies in relative to their size, and apart from maybe some, I don't think there is pipelines, but strategically they're not crucial to the existence of ECOWAS, so they might be suspended, but it doesn't undermine the complete organization as a whole. Until a couple of weeks ago, whenever you have a coup in Niger, following the same sort of modus operandi as what's happened in Burkina Faso, resentment at the French inability to properly combat the ongoing insurgencies, economic dislocation and collapse across the country results in the military stepping in and ousting the quote-unquote democratically elected government and the president. Bizarrely, as I said at the start of the stream, is they seem to allow the deposed president to continue to be able to tweet and onto Facebook and to write articles for the New York Times. Again, the wisdom of that, while you're trying to legitimize your military overthrow, is sketchy at best. But this really throws the spanner into ECOWAS. ECOWAS starts to look more, instead of a coalition of Western African states, it looks to be more of a appendages to Nigeria than it does a union of states. And also, as I mentioned very early in the stream, is a lot of French uranium used for French nuclear power is mined in Niger as well. And then you have gold and other minerals, precious minerals that are mined across the region that often find their way into French industries and French banks. So a bit on ECOWAS, like I say, is kind of this tepid European Union style customs, economic, political security union. But the big beast in ECOWAS is by far Nigeria. It holds by far the largest population, by far the largest economy, and by far the largest military. So whenever you have a coalition of all these various states, it kind of evens out Nigeria to a degree. Whenever you have 3 other states fall away, 4 with Guinea. 1, you have Northern ECOWAS and Senegal and the Gambia are now cut off by a land bridge because Guinea is now suspended because I think it might have, I'm not too sure the story behind Guinea. I think it might be another country that underwent a coup. But you have Northern ECOWAS is now separated from the rest of the Union through this sort of belt of coup d'etatist powers, and the remaining parts of the Union are more just looking like an economic appendage to the economic might of Nigeria. So the entire viability of the Union starts to come under serious question. So ECOWAS, under French insistence and seemingly American encouragement, starts to put pressure and threats towards the new Niger authorities that either they restore constitutional government or enter into some kind of far-reaching negotiations with ECOWAS, or else there'll be a military intervention. And this is kind of where we come into what might be happening now. So I haven't checked the internet for a little bit, so I'm just going to do a quick scan and see if we have any latest news. Just in because I've been speaking for a little while, so I haven't been able to scan and see what the latest is. So ECOWAS gave an ultimatum that expired 1 hour 25 minutes ago. So at midnight on Sunday/Monday, as in like today, is that there was the ultimatum to restore the old president and constitutional government, or else there would be dire ramifications. And that ultimatum has obviously passed. We have no TAMs put on Niger, but there is no reports so far that the military intervention has begun. Some saying that ECOWAS says its forces need more time to prepare. Others say that they're moving into position, but as of now, it does not look like they have invaded yet. So we're going to talk about the invasion itself, the hypothetical invasion, if it is to come, and what it might mean, because while you have this coalition of ECOWAS states that have said that they would invade, you have Niger and Burkina Faso. You have Mali and Burkina Faso have said that they would come to the aid of Niger in the event of this intervention. And also in the past couple of days is probably even more notable. We have reports that the lead elements of Wagner have started to deploy to Niger, which I think is probably the big story, because to put it bluntly, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali are military insignificant powers. There's no two ways to put about it. Their militaries are small. They're very poorly trained. These are post-colonial West African militaries. Countries with very small economies. Very small economies can only fund very small and very poor militaries. So, these are not the countries that in some kind of scenario are liable to completely drive off foreign intervention. Whereas even most of the ECOWAS, in fact, all of the ECOWAS states, their militaries are pretty insignificant. Very small air forces. You're talking about, at best, Nigeria is the big exception here. So the countries I'm talking about exclude Nigeria. So all these ECOWAS states, whenever it comes to like air force size, you're talking the best you've got is maybe a dozen fighter aircraft, and how many of those are operational? Because pretty much all of them were supplied to these countries in the Cold War, either from the Soviet Union or Western powers. The operability of these aircraft are sketchy at best, or they've been fighting in civil wars through the 90s and the 2000s, and you know the maintenance on these aircraft are sketchy. Most of these countries don't have any kind of tanks, or like if they're the closest thing they'll have to a tank are probably a few old BTR-60s given by the USSR in the 70s or the 80s. So most of ECOWAS also have militarily insignificant power. But then we come to Nigeria, and it really has to be stated, like, Nigeria is the superpower of the region. Nigeria is a big beast of a country in this region. Its population, I think, is up to like 600 million now at the moment. Let's have a quick look just to verify. A economy of 1.3 trillion. Oh no, 600 million. I'm far over. And a population of 230 million people. So Nigeria has almost near enough double the population of Russia. A couple tens of millions less, but far outstrips all the neighboring countries in terms of population. Its economy far exceeds all its neighbors. And alongside of this, Nigeria actually fields, for an African country, a fairly decent military in terms of size. Of course, Nigeria has a long history of military conflict. You have the ongoing Boko Haram insurgencies in the north of the country in the 70s. You have the Biafran civil war. But alongside this is you have a significant oil industry. And Nigeria, for an African country, Nigeria is kind of one of the better run, and especially in this part of Western Africa, it's probably one of the best run countries in terms of government. Still corrupt, still very chaotic, but in terms of like African standards in this part of Africa, it is kind of a big heavyweight of a country. Its military far exceeds pretty much all the other countries surrounding it combined. So if there is going to be an ECOWAS intervention, it's going to be a Nigerian intervention. One, because Niger, the only borders that Niger has with ECOWAS members, well, continuing ECOWAS members, are Benin. And Benin is a military insignificant power, but its longest border is with Nigeria. So if there is going to be an intervention, it will be the Nigerians doing it. You might have small contingents that come from the other ECOWAS states, but it will be Nigerian blood and it will be Nigerian gold that will be behind it. You could have French and American air power that might come in and assist it, but it will be the Nigerians who will be doing the fighting on the ground if there is to be any fighting at all. So this is why the Niger army, from what reports over the past few hours, are deploying its military along border areas, particularly around the capital. Again, whenever it comes to these countries, especially these Sahel states, like Mali and Niger on paper are huge countries. Geographically, they are huge. But you have to understand that the vast bulk of Niger, the northern part of Niger, and the entire north of Mali it's the Sahara Desert. It's desert, it's arid terrain, there's not much there, and occasional towns in very small cities. So the base of power of Niger is very much in this sort of I know people are going to, it's often called the chicken wing country, and do not read too much into it, but it does kind of look like a chicken wing, so I'm using that analogy. This little leg, the little like bone part of the chicken wing, that is where like the political and economic and military power of Niger is going to be based around the capital, Niamey. So this is where the Nigerians were strike. They might try and cross the border to the north, but I don't expect you'll see much of a Nigerian offensive up into the desert. It will be about taking the capital. And then if Burkina Faso and Mali do come through on their threat to stand by Niger in the face of military intervention, if they can actually deploy any kind of forces beyond their borders, it will be going towards Niamey to defend the capital. Which kind of brings us into the whole aspect of African militaries in general. Nigeria might be a big beast. It has tanks. It has a fairly sizable army. A fairly large army and a fairly sizable air force. But it is an African military at the end of the day, and I don't say this in a derogatory way, but sub-Saharan African militaries, apart from maybe South Africa, are not exactly known for their military prowess or projection of power. So, while the Nigerian army might be able to fight insurgents within Nigeria, in northern Nigeria, the ability for the Nigerian army to invade a neighboring country and sustain a logistics chain to support the invading troops and any resulting occupation, I honestly have no idea, and I'm a bit skeptical if that is majorly feasible. Whenever African militaries deploy troops outside their borders, the big example I'm going to use here is Somalia, where you have an ongoing African Union deployment. The logistics and the money for that all comes from the West. It's like Western aid that comes in to fund logistics and the military deployment in Somalia. So like I believe you have like Ugandan, Kenyan, I think you actually have Nigerian troops. The point is, what I'm trying to say here is that African countries, in terms of like their military capability, they're not exactly developed much in terms of projection of power. It's mostly about domestic security, or it's about peacekeeping operations abroad. But those peacekeeping operations is you provide the soldiers and some of the light equipment, but everything else, the logistics, trains, and everything else is provided by like the United Nations or the African Union, which actually in turn is actually provided by Western states. So it might be one thing for Uganda to send a division towards the capital, but do they have the... I mean, it might sound a bit basic, like, well, you know, if Western economies can deliver bread on time every day across their entire countries to supermarkets, surely like Africans should be able to sustain a military intervention, like Nigeria should be able to sustain a military intervention into a neighboring state. Yeah, it gets a bit complicated whenever it comes to military interventions, and I would go back and look at what we've been talking about the past year. The big problem with the Russian invasion into Ukraine, at least one of the big problems, was logistics train. They really didn't seem to put a lot of thought into how they would sustain operations in the opening invasion in Ukraine. And this is when, like in February and March last year, we seen like all the Russian tanks running out of fuel, or Russian troops who were only given very limited amounts of ammunition, or like the infamous 40-kilometer Russian convoy that came down from Chernobyl, or, you know, what I'm trying to say is if the Russians had problems doing it, and, you know, this is Russia, but granted, the Russians kind of fucked up on their own part, but military logistics can be very complicated, and it is very complicated to a degree that I'm not an expert or have any deep insight into the Nigerian or African militaries, but logistics in Western militaries have their own cores. It is a very fine-tuned science. It is a very fine-tuned profession. It is something that is rigorously tested and has been tested in combat for the past couple decades in Western states through deployments like Afghanistan and Iraq. Do I think that Nigeria or pretty much any African state has really put in like the theoretical and the tangible real life experience to develop a logistics system that could sustain a significant invasion and occupation of a neighboring state? Needless to say, I'm skeptical of it. So that's kind of one scenario I'm looking at, is you could have this Nigerian invasion of Niger. I really don't expect the Nigerian army and even the Malian and the Burkina Fasoans to put up a lot of resistance in the face of this military. The scenario I see that might happen if this does go down is that the Nigerians and ECOWAS go in, take the capital, very little fighting, and we have a sort of African Iraq scenario. So the government collapses, well, quote unquote collapses, the Nigerians and ECOWAS come in and reestablish quote unquote constitutional order. But then a scenario that could come about is you could have Wagner operating in the country, starts to advise and builds up its own insurgency against this ECOWAS intervention, and the entire thing comes into a quagmire. That's one scenario that could come about of it. The other thing that's kind of no one really seems to talk about, if the Nigerians just drive into Niger and overthrow the military government, well, what happens to the Islamist insurgency that's raging in the north of the country? A complete collapse of military and central government power will probably mean that a significant amount of territory in the north is going to fall to the Salafist and Islamist groups. Nigeria is, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is fighting a pretty brutal insurgency against its own Islamist groups, namely Boko Haram in the north of Nigeria. The Biafran separatists, for people who are not aware, this part of Nigeria, very oil-rich part in the 60s and the 70s, broke away from Nigeria, and there was a very brutal civil war. This is the territory that used to be the Republic of Biafra. Over the past couple months, there's been various attacks building up from Biafran separatists. You have a not as unstable in other states, but you don't exactly have the most stable political and government situation in Nigeria. So, is Nigeria in the place to, one, fight the domestic insurgencies and problems that it has in its own country, invade a neighbouring power, and by invading this neighbouring power, you would assume will inherit the need to fight the Islamist insurgency in the country that it's just invaded. So, like I say, I'm very much putting this all on Nigeria because I don't think any of these other West African states really has the ability or the ability, the manpower, the economy, or the military infrastructure to sustain an operation like this. And Nigeria is the superpower of the region, but is Nigeria able to sustain this? I'm skeptical of it. But of course, this also goes with saying we don't know if at this stage the Nigerians might be supported by American or French air forces that might act as their air power in the air, which would alleviate the pressure on the Nigerian military. You know, these are options that I guess we'll find out in the potential days and potential weeks ahead. So, if this does happen, the worst, quote-unquote, worst-case scenario is the Nigerians invade Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso enter the conflict, and the entire thing just descends into a massive regional war that spills across the Sahel. And who knows, you could probably have the Russians via Wagner, which could feed in training and expertise into the coup d'etatist, whatever you want to call them, powers to fight various insurgencies or pitched battles with them. And the entire region just falls into anarchy and chaos. That's like probably the quote unquote like worst case scenario that we could see in this area. Alongside this, of course, you would have Western powers would feed in their own intelligence, their own economic and military might as well. So Western Africa could potentially just fall into a complete proxy conflict between Russia and the West. Of course, that's not to say it would just be them. There are very deep indigenous issues that have resulted in this potential conflict. But of course, is throughout the Cold War and into the modern era, it is local conflicts and local issues through which outside powers can feed their own efforts and material to fight various proxy conflicts. So, I think that is everything off the top of my head. I'll give a quick look and see if we have any more news. If there's any updates. So if anyone has any questions, if anyone has any super chats, especially, thank you so much. That'd be so great. Let me have a quick look and see if we have any updates. Air France flights cancelled. Lots of disruption in civil aviation. Johannesburg to London flight from British Airways has made a major U-turn, and it looks like it's going back to South Africa. Closure of the French government has advised its citizens not to travel to Mali, Burkina Faso, or Niger, and if they are in the country, they are to leave as soon as possible. So no reports of any actual military action yet, but the stage is definitely being set and prepared. Let's have a quick at Twitter and see if we have any updates on that. Niger junta announced that it has completed its intervention plans, and the two Western African countries have begun pre-deployment of their troops across the border between Niger. Well, that means Benin and Nigeria. So, you'll probably have a token element of the Benin military, but I wouldn't be surprised if like the Nigerian game plan I could see here is they'll make a play for the capital. That would be the main and logical thing, and the push up south from Benin and from the east from the border with Nigeria would make the most logical sense. Then the wild card is how Burkina Faso might react to that. For all we know, maybe the Nigerians will take care of their own border, and if they're the rest of the ECOWAS militaries, what scant military power they do have, maybe they've deployed them to Benin as like a multinational force. And maybe that is where they could make their intervention from there. Bring this up. Let's have a look. So this is a list of countries that are a state of play. So red, countries that said they would partake. So it's not even all of ECOWAS. It's Senegal, Ivory Coast, Benin, and Nigeria. Because it looks like Ghana, Togo, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea-Bissau are pretty much ambivalent. And you have Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso on the Niger side, Chad, Algeria. I haven't really mentioned much of Algeria. Algeria is like another regional superpower. Very large country, fairly decent economy, but also a major military power. Very, very big importer of Russian military arms. Nigeria is one of Algeria is one of the few countries outside of Russia and like India that operates the T-90. A very big importer of advanced Russian military equipment and one of Moscow's diplomatic allies overseas. Can't see Algeria intervening militarily, but nonetheless, it factors into the state of play. Although Algeria's like influence is more felt north of the Sahel than it is south. Nigeria is kind of like the big dog south of the Sahel, whereas Algeria is mostly like its projection of power. One, it has ongoing territorial disputes with Morocco, and the Polisario, however you pronounce it, the West Saharan conflict, the anti-Moroccan faction there is mostly funded and backed by Algeria, so that's where a lot of Algerian military power is projected against. But also the conflict in Libya is Algeria tries to affect a bit of influence that way. So you kind of have two big African quote-unquote superpowers on either side of this, but I really can't see the Algerians intervening militarily into this. See if we have any. France has suspended all development aid to Burkina Faso. Responsibility to Nigerians, not ECOWAS. It's like a Nigerian channel.
Answers to us, not even address Nigerians, justify what they're going to do, going to the Senate to ask for approval. No way to declare war. Not easy declaring war. You are sending your men and women into harm's way. Go and get killed and killed. I've said it clearly from the outset of that piece I wrote. I am not into political correctness. We in the North, we're tired of wars. We've been at war for 13 years. For 14 years now with Boko Haram, 2009. And 9 years with bandits and kidnappers. They're bringing a fresh war to us. And we share the Niger Republic. Long before the creation of these two entities, Niger and Nigeria, we have shared heritages, our culture, in our religion, in our language. We share a border over 1,000 kilometers from the west, the northwesterly end, Kebbi, to the northeasterly end in Borno. We have Zabarmas in Nigeria. Yeah. We have Hausas. They are the predominant tribe in Niger, 53%. We have Fulanis. We have Kanuris. The whole of the far region around the northeast of Nigeria, they are Kanuris. So we're going to war and killing them for what? Before any president goes to war, he comes and explains to his people, these are the reasons why I'm going to war. What are the strategic importance? Economic, security, or political strategic importance of going to war? What are the self-interests of that country in going to war? If we are going to war on their behalf, the Western world, France and the United States, they know what their interests are. Their strategic interest is not the people of Nigeria or Nigeria, but what is underneath the soil of Nigeria and Nigeria.
Okay. Surprisingly insightful. Lagos, London. All eyes on ECOWAS, a 7-day. Well, that's actually quite a decent little clip because it kind of expands on the conflicts I was outlining that affect Nigeria. And I haven't really touched on it, but I probably should have. Should be said that, you know, these colonial era borders aren't the most respective of the populations that live in them, so you'll have same ethnic groups that will live on same sides on different sides of the borders and stuff. But I think that gentleman in that clip actually quite a good little clip, very insightful little clip, kind of elucidated that far better than I ever could. Nice little find on Twitter there. I really have a bad feeling that just showing that the country's name is going to get me banned. The CNSP, that's the name of the currently in power junta in Niger. So they are very much of the impression that the invasion is going to be coming. Like I say, Just pay attention to where you see these Russian flags. Like I say, very much the rejection of French and Western influence in these states whenever these coup d'etatist powers come into play. Should also be said that with the collapse of the Black Sea grain deal, part of the aspect of that was Russia said it would pick up free of charge and supply grain to all African states as part of the recent Russia-Africa state summit. That Russia would take over free of charge the supply of grain to African countries. So that very much is a play for influence on in Africa, particularly the Sahel region. So, while all eyes are on Africa, very much the big power play for influence globally is this territory of West Africa. And it should be said that going on like long-term projections in terms of population and economics, if these countries like ever properly stop being shitholes, for lack of a better term, sorry if that's overly offensive, but if they stabilize and a decent like rule of law starts to come in, like the economic potential of these Western African states are pretty massive. I mean, just look at the growth of Nigeria being the best example, and even then, it's still a fairly unstable and anarchic country. If it was a very well run and stabilized country, they would be massive economic powers in the global economy. This is why China has been investing very heavily in Africa. This is why I think the Russians are very much pushing their influence into the continent and into Western Africa, is because the potential, the economic potential, is pretty big. And like UN statistics for long-term economic and population growth for these states are massive. I think Nigeria is projected to be like the third largest country in the world in terms of population by the end of the century, and I think it's meant to be like the fifth or the sixth largest economy as well. And then all these other Western African states, like I say, if they're able to get their shit together, should potentially do pretty handsomely as well. So, no military intervention as such. It doesn't surprise me too much, as I would not expect them to go in at night. It's more footage of that rally. Audio is glitchy on the video, but not on your audio. Because OBS isn't picking it up. Why is that? Try that now. I think that should be it fixed now. Sorry, my bad. I don't know why OBS is reset, which my audio was.
soutiens indéfectibles de notre peuple sont prêts pour défendre l'intégrité de notre territoire et l'honneur de notre patrie.
So, if your bike was stolen recently, you might see it on a video of a war in Africa. France has put Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger under no-fly warning for its citizens. Following confirmation from officials in the Niger Republic of the presence of Wagner PMC in the country, Wagner itself has just issued a press release confirming that its armed combat divisions is present in the country to protect the new military administration against any attack from a foreign... Oh. If this is true, it will be very interesting to see how Wagner does up against the Nigerian military. Obviously, man for man, I would expect Wagner to far outpace any African military, but how sustainable operations could be in the country against the full weight of a Nigerian offensive, it would be very interesting to see. And like I say, I think if it does come to pass, the long game here would probably be a Wagner directed and supported and funded insurgency. Well, I'm pretty sure that the Russians ideally don't want to get into a proxy war with Nigeria and Western African states that they're trying to court. But if Nigeria is kind of throwing all that off to effectively become I don't want to say a proxy of the West, because it's more that their interests align here rather than Nigeria like being a Western puppet. But you know, if that's the route it goes down to, probably the best aspect would be just making a Nigerian intervention and potential occupation just as costly as possible to Nigeria via an insurgency. That would probably be the longer game, because even depending on what Wagner has put into the country, which I don't think would be too much, and how sustainable that operation would be whenever the air power is very sketchy, unless the Algerians are like, fuck it, we'll allow you to bring stuff across the northern borders. I'm kind of sketchy on just how sustainable is the Nigerian invasion going to be on one hand, but also how sustainable in a hostile environment surrounded by potentially, because I mean Chad I think is not going to allow Wagner to transit across the country. So if these three countries are effectively isolated, if Algeria doesn't play ball, then how is Wagner going to get in enough men and material to sustain an insurgency? You know, that's kind of the thought process that's kicking around my head. Let's see if we've got any. Senegal. Haven't mentioned Senegal as well, but it should be said that the opposition in Senegal was apparently very pro-Russian, and he's been recently arrested, and there's an ongoing political purge in Senegal. Maybe they assumed that there was like a potential coup threat as well on their part. Rybar given any takes? Clashes have increased between government forces, militants from the local Islamic State.
За последние недели в Мали увеличилось количество столкновений.
I was hoping that was going to be in English, but earlier this morning, a military camp in the town of Sivar in Mopti region came under attack. Islamic radicals blew up 3 car bombs, which they opened fire from in small arms. Local residents also reported explosions. 29 people reported to have died. So, yeah, while we're all talking about this potential massive regional war, like I say, these Islamist insurgencies are still raging. And if there was like any invasion or military intervention, oh, this was months ago. Don't know why this was so far back. If there was any regional war or military intervention, it would probably be the Islamist insurgents who would win the most. No reports from Rybar on what's happening in Africa at the moment, so... So, what are you guys saying? Any super chats? None at all. Thank you, chat. I appreciate that. How is Niger a naval power? I don't think they are. If they do have any naval, I assume it would just be like a river patrol boats. I like African. It's easier to understand. Glitchy audio on the video. Weight only grain. The Russians and Chinese gotta be throwing in some chrome rims and cell phones on the deal. Yeah, maybe whenever the Americans decide, okay, we'll give Air Jordans, a bunch of Air Jordans and development aid. Maybe that's whenever the Chinese will offer their bit. Pedal power MRAPs. Speaking of that. Where is the video? Speaking of pedal power MRAPs. We might see this come into the war. I mean, if I was a Wagner man, if I'd fought through Bakhmut, if I'd you know, sweat, blood, toil, and tears in the fury of the battles of Ukraine. I was in Niger and I seen this coming up the road. Yeah. I mean, I'd like to see this turn a hard corner. I think that would do a hard corner really well. Considering the very minor bumps on the road that it was going over and how much it was wobbling, I can, yeah. So much to avoid the mines trap. latest in African armored personnel technology. It's going to be a fun war if it happens. So, this is awesome in its own way. It is, but pay good money to see that go up against the. Does it have hydraulics? It had a fire extinguisher inside of it. Oh. Check. A very impromptu stream chat, but do follow the Telegram group if you aren't already in there. That is where the stuff happens all the time. What is this? Please don't be anything racist. The branch of Al-Qaeda in Mali announced a siege of a certain group of Wagnerites in a village on the border with Niger. One interesting surprise. I'll give that a share. Might be interesting. So if you're not already, do get into the Telegram group. That's where stuff happens on a day-to-day basis. Another quick scan. In fact, no, we didn't look at the what's that Indian news channel saying? Where's that? Where did I put that Indian news channel?
Senators agreed to pass a resolution condemning the coup, but ruled out military options.
Okay. We'll have a look at this and see what the Indians are saying.
Moving on now, as the ECOWAS deadline comes to an end today, all eyes are on Niger. In response to the rising anti-French sentiment in the African nation, counter-protests were witnessed in Paris to express solidarity with the former president, Mohamed Bazoum. Protesters gathered near the Niger embassy in Paris to show their support for democracy and President Bazoum's government. They held signs and Niger flags while calling for Bazoum's release. The Niger Prime Minister, Mahamadou, joined the demonstration and said that he was concerned about ECOWAS's ultimatum. He said that successful negotiations are still possible. Niger's junta faces a Sunday deadline set by the Economic Community of West African States. Defense chiefs from the bloc have drawn up a plan for military action if the coup leaders do not reinstate Bazoum. ECOWAS's options range from a ground invasion to aiding a homegrown counter-coup. France has extended full support to ECOWAS's upcoming decision. Meanwhile, the junta run...
Does anyone know of any African, like West African TV channels, news channels in English that might be talking about it? BBC News Nigeria Live.
Political experience to be given that privilege to say, okay, to pretend over the affairs of the ministry, when you know that ministry also will be able to muster to get things done.
I understand you, Mr. Jadi. You have anything to say on that?
Well, I have to give a different slant to it. You see,
Refinitiv WorldCheck is still registered to the same address as Thomson Reuters in the Canary Wharf business district of London.
No.
If you take Burkina Faso,
Pan-African television.
Of the land territory of Burkina Faso is occupied
This is a
by
guy
Islamic
who looks like we need to know his opinion.
The Islamic insurgents are attacking Burkina, they're attacking Guinea, they're attacking Mali. There have been reports that they've attacked northern Benin and northern Togo. Intelligence reports suggest that these Islamic insurgents have sleeping bases in Ghana, and that they have moved as far south as below Tamale and so on. This
Comrade
is a reality.
Kwesi Pratt Jr.,
You
the General
understand?
Secretary of the
Then we
Socialist
talk about the
Movement of
piracy
Ghana.
in the Atlantic Ocean, which is also growing and is becoming a major concern for the international community. Then there is the Azawad movement, which is fighting for the Azawad Republic, which strikes all over, you know, over the...
Azawad is the name of the Tuareg breakaway state in the north of Mali. This is the proclaimed Republic of Azawad. Digit up for $7.87. Thank you so much. That's very generous. Niger. Yep. Niger. We are talking about Niger. The flag of Niger looks like the flag of India. Different shades of... it does, I guess. Yes, not a very original country name, not a very original flag. Have a look what it means. National colors of orange and green. Flag forms one of the official... Number of sources have described the intent as yet to become... Okay, they don't even know what the flag means, basically. The upper orange represents the Sahara Desert or the Sahel. The center white band represents purity of the Niger River. And the land grain, the fertile region. That's a nice flag, if it is a flag. An interesting pattern to it. Like a kind of Japanese prefectural flag or something. You know, I think if they had different colors for this, I think that could be a pretty good flag, but... Tuareg. Yeah, well, it's what are we at? 2 o'clock in the morning. I think if something is going to happen, it's probably going to be in daylight. Or potentially in days ahead. It sounds like they haven't properly set up their forces if they are going to go in, and there's probably some last minute negotiations and diplomatic stuff going on behind the scenes. So yeah, not getting it right at the moment. He's speaking English or Pidgin English. Comrade Koasi, I think he was speaking fairly coherent English. It wasn't Pidgin. You stop having so many fucking tabs. That's all the flights that have been rerouted around Niger. Interesting. Still going over Burkina Faso and Mali, but they are completely avoiding Niger. This British Airways flight looks like it's just completely returned back around and is going back to must be South Africa. I always wonder, has he been shot in the face? Because he has like scars on both cheeks. Only thing better than democracy is more democracy. Big disagree. Mr. Nigerian man, big disagree. Niger has the world's highest fertility rate with 6.7 kids per woman. And the world's lowest median age, 14.8 years. Jesus Christ. Said they closed. It's not exactly breaking news. It was hours ago.
Fort du soutien indéfectible de notre peuple.
Let's see. If there's any. So yeah, probably gonna start rounding it out, but that little graphic just kind of made me kind of pick up on something I didn't properly, I kind of touched on, but I didn't fully address. Like I say, it was mentioned earlier on that there's a lot of uranium that comes out of Niger that funds French uranium. Yeah, what did I just say? Nigerian uranium that powers French nuclear power plants. There's also significant oil deposits that are stretched across this region. Of course, the most developed ones are currently in Nigeria, and mineral deposits. So an aspect of what Russia could be playing here is by taking these countries out of French and therefore European and Western orbit, is they're further denying resources and strangling Europe in terms of resource sustainability and imports. So with that, do follow me on Twitter if you aren't already. Everything's mostly done on Telegram, but do follow me on Twitter and check out the link tree for other social media that I never use and really need to start to do. And if you're minded to support me financially, every penny is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. There is PayPal. If you want to sign up for a monthly subscription, if you want to give me like $5 a month, which is especially grateful, that's the stuff that helps me budget from month to month. You can do that on Coffee, or there's Cash App. Or if you're a crypto bro and you're that generous, there are links in the video below. So, doesn't look like there'll be much more. So, depending on what happens over the next 24 hours, I might do another stream on Tuesday. Depending on what the situation is there. But like I say, if there is going to be a military intervention, I would expect it would happen during daylight or maybe in the days to come. So I think we're probably, hopefully this stream has given you all kind of the basic rundown on the where, the whys, and a bit of the whens. We are where we are and how this relates kind of back to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine and the wider geostrategic struggle that's going on across the planet in Africa at the moment. So I hope it's been a bit insightful on that. How long have we gone for? Just over 2 hours, so a bit longer than I wanted to, but sorry, kind of a poor quality stream. I've just been so busy lately with wagey job, and this was kind of sprung on me very last minute. So with that, I'm going to kind of sign it off here. Thank you very much to the super chatter, is very generous. Like I say, check out the links below and follow me on the other stuff, and potentially see you on Tuesday, depending on what happens over the next 24 hours. So have a good one, everyone, and speak to you soon. See ya.